one option is to self-handicap for a few minutes, and I'm not going to avail myself of that. This has been a delightful conference from start to, I hope, finish. I thought I had total power, that I was blocking the only exit, but I see there's an exit there, and there, and there. So you have a sufficient amount of freedom in case things become too heavy. Resurrecting a serious academic kind of mindset at the moment is a little bit of a chore. I think it can be done with your help. I hope so. So the title is why are the obedience experiments still? I think I put it in quotation in parentheses. So prominent, famous, but problematic. And I was going to start with the reverse. Start with the problematics, because they're kind of in keeping with the conference. But I am going to open with prominence and fame. Just a few points on those topics. So there's three concepts: prominence, fame, and problematics, or problems, or problematical. And for prominence, I'm not going to use the fact that we're at a conference about Milgram. It's hard to get more prominent. If somebody had a conference about my work in 50 years, I would say that Miller's is pretty prominent. Conferences aren't held for non-prominent individuals, but that's a little bit circular. The question is why. Why has he been so prominent that he would warrant a conference like this? I'll choose as one example of prominence the undergraduate textbook. We haven't talked much about that, and it may be in some people's mind not that interesting. We know that the Milgram experiments are described in introductory psych and social psych, and that's been true for decades. Nonetheless, I want to emphasize their prominence in contemporary textbooks. I don't have exact figures, but over the decades, I would estimate that millions of students have been taught the Milgram experiments, in maybe even in high school. It's ubiquitous, and the volume of people that have been introduced to the experiments, and in some cases given the opportunity to learn a great deal about them, by the way, not trivial, not sophomoric, but really first-rate treatment you would find in many of these books. So I wrote to about 8 authors of textbooks. I emailed them, wrote. There's a term for it. And I sent it to David Myers and Doug Kenrick and Elliott Smith, Saul Casson, Roy Baumeister, Robert Barron, and Elliot Aronson. Most of you should know most of those names. And I asked them, lo and behold, I'm appearing giving the keynote address at a conference, and I would ask you just to give me a few sentences, if you would, why you devote so much attention to the Milgram experiments in your textbooks. The amount of space, it's been true for decades, is enormous, and now it's really achieving really incredible amounts of coverage. It's expensive. Space is expensive in textbooks, and for every paragraph that you devote to the Milgram experiment, you can't devote to something that I did, or something that Tom Blass did, or something that Nestar will do. So, in other words, it's a zero-sum thing to an extent. These textbooks only have so much space, and it's... So I'll read you just the letter from Saul Casson at... is it Boston? Where is Saul at? Williams, that's right. It was Audie. Hi, Art. in the most recent edition of Cassin, Fine, and Marcus, we dedicate 11 text pages to Milgram, beginning with a careful description of his experiments and ending in sections on obedience in the 21st century and defiance when people rebel, in quotes. Interestingly, we give more coverage now, not less, than we did in our first edition 20 years ago. By the way, they all write almost the identical clone type response. The reason is simple. Milgram is, in capital, is social psychology, more than any other program of research, and illustrates the two core themes, I believe, of the discipline, that situations can overwhelm us and that people fail to appreciate the power of the situation. So he goes on, but these to me are the core issues the field has wrestled with, and Milgram's program of research raises each and every one of these issues. So see, that's not really answering my question. It's one thing to give coverage, 11 pages. Can you imagine your work receiving 11, 9, 7, 5, 3 pages in a textbook for decades? What would you have to do to achieve that? 11 pages. The only, see, it's the extravagant amount of space that I asked them about, but they didn't answer that. Because it's always been true that what he said about the content and the message of the power of the situation, that's always been true. There really is nothing new there. The only person who gave what I would call a somewhat more interesting answer is Robert Barron, who said in just a tiny paragraph, are you all in the mood for a tiny paragraph, like 5 lines? He goes, intriguing question, Art. I actually knew Milgram, and he felt that his work was really seminal and groundbreaking. No, maybe he meant I felt. But is he a Freudian slip? Oh, no, it wasn't. In one sense, I think he was right. But why do we keep it in the book? See, that's what I asked. I think because it provides such a powerful example of social influence in action. But I always try when I write about it to mention the very complex issues involving this work. And really, that's why I say that the papers at this conference, including every paper, every panel, has the chance of making it in these textbooks. They're dying for new information about Milgram, pro or con or in between. But I always try when I write about it to mention the very complex issues involving this work. Now, he's the only one who said this. Now, to be perfectly candid, if we didn't include it, see, it's sort of the counterfactual or the something like that. If we didn't underline, we'd probably face harsh criticism from many colleagues who love teaching about it. I hope these brief comments help. Several give good wishes to the conference, by the way. See, that's what I was trying to get at. If we didn't include it, we'd probably face harsh criticism from many colleagues who have loved teaching about it. In other words, it's become a kind of gifted child of the discipline in the eyes of many. Gifted, or I would say famous, or some, of course, are going to say infamous. But whatever, it has become a special kind of case. Unlike no other. We know other studies get prominent coverage. Ash you always see those lines, right? And you always see the picture of Phil Zimbardo's prisoners and guards in almost every text, right? But they don't get 11 pages. They don't get, I would say, they get 20% of what Milgram gets, or maybe less or a little more. So, there's this constant, every semester, tens of thousands, I don't know, who knows how many, get fed this. And it's a very powerful dosage of Milgram, nonstop. So that it's it's a force to reckon with, whether you adore the experiments or find fault with them. You have to reckon with them because they're getting this incredible salient kind of attention. And you could say, is that a problem? Well, I think it is a little bit of a problem. There's a part of me that thinks that the research doesn't deserve that much coverage. And I feel a little bit hesitant to go too far on that score because it's a little bit like biting the hand that has fed me. And I really mean that, but I'll talk, maybe get that in later. So, aside from all of the research that we've covered that cites Milgram and all of the criticism and so forth, you do have this powerful force. And I always reveled and loved to teach it, and it made social psychology come alive, and the students were interested in how far would you go. But many studies in social psychology are fascinating and like that. And Ash was fascinating, and it's just not simply something substantive about Milgram. There's some aura that it has achieved that seems to just suck the air out of fair treatment in some cases of other topics. It really hogs the show, so to speak. And cynically, from a marketing perspective, you could say that, well, it sells. Milgram sells. Milgram is hot. In an advertising sense. And professors want to excite their students. They want things that are fascinating and stimulating and controversial and unethical, no less. What could be better? 11 pages for an unethical study with no theory and not hardly any follow-up research until lately, except for the Utrecht studies and a couple of others. So it's really kind of a remarkable phenomenon in itself. I don't pretend to understand it in any detail, but I think it deserves reckoning with. It deserves thinking about a little bit. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. On fame, I have a lot to say about fame, but I'll limit it to a few things. Fame seems close to prominence, doesn't it? But fame seems just a little different. It's correlated, but in my factor analysis for the title, I came up with fame as a separate construct from prominence. And I guess one way to describe the fame is that people commonly say that it's the most famous study in the world. It's like that advertising, the most interesting guy in the world. Milgram is like the most famous study in the world. Okay, we'll limit it to social science. Let's not smear physics and DNA. I won't claim that it's more famous than those developments. But it really achieves this kind of exuberant. Here's how Steve Reicher and Alex Haslam and Joan Smith introduced their recent article in PPS, Working Toward the Experimenter. Just over 50 years ago, in July 1961, Stanley Milgram embarked on what were to become the most famous studies in social psychology, if not the discipline of psychology as a whole. I said that in my '86 book, that these are the most famous studies in social science. And people commonly say that. I didn't have a clue when I wrote that whether they were the most famous studies in the world. I did not have one iota of data to support that statement. I just said it. And Steve and Alex, who you wouldn't expect them to open their article with that kind of, Now, that's why I think famous is different than prominent. If something can be famous, you can despise something that's famous. I mean, I don't think fame automatically means love, although it seems to be a positive word, fame. And if somebody called me famous, or the most famous social psychologist in the world, I would think it a plus. Wouldn't you feel that way? Why do people talk that way about this thing? It's many people. I mean, if you went on a Google search for who's calling the Milgram experiments the most famous study in the world? What's the cash value in that statement? What motivates it? Why do you need to go there? There are many famous studies in social psychology. I've always felt the Ash experiments were just as famous and just as significant intellectually, maybe more so. I mean, that doesn't matter. We all have our favorites, and there are many great ones. But why this kind of singularity, this sort of almost worshipful kind of laudation, adoration almost? It's a strange phenomenon. It's just stated as a fact, it's a self-evident fact. You don't think it's the most famous study in the world? Are you going to write a letter to the editor and criticize that claim? You could say, it's not that serious. Why take it so seriously? But I think if we're at a conference on Milgram and people are saying it's the most famous study in the world, I think it's a relevant kind of phenomenon. And as long as I think fame can be a barrier. Fame can be an obstacle. Fame can be self-fulfilling. Fame can be biasing. If you know that X is the most famous thing in the world and you haven't studied it yet, you're liable to feel obligated to feel that it deserves that attribution. I mean, you're influenced by somebody else calling it famous. So it's a big term, fame. You can't. If you wanted it today, what could you do to become famous? It'd be hard, wouldn't it? I mean, it's not easily won. And once you're stamped with it, it's probably not easily lost either. So it could be part of the problem, which is the last part of my talk. And I think the triumph of this conference, one of the triumphs, is to, not be blindsided by the radiation effect of the Milgram aura, the bright, shining light that can sort of just paralyze thought. Now there are other reasons why has it become so famous? That's sort of another story that I can't get into. But it was famous very early, and I attribute that to Baumrein's criticism. That immediately broadcast the entire study to thousands of American psychologists, American Psychological Association members, who had never heard of the Milgram study. So it's really been somewhat famous for almost all of the 50 years that it's been in existence. And, of course, the association with the Holocaust made it famous, too. That was an important ingredient for its initial superstar status, because many of these comments would have been true 40 years ago as they are tonight. And one needn't pursue why proffering a possible account of the Holocaust, or even a part of the Holocaust, would make something famous. Because understanding the Holocaust was considered a noble intellectual pursuit, and it still is. I mean, it occupies libraries full of literature in different disciplines. So certainly that was a major early contributor. I think it's less of a factor now. I thought at one time it was really 90% of the Milgram story was the Holocaust. I think it's much less than that now. I don't think that many people are interested in the Holocaust. Many are, some are, but it's not on everybody's mind all the time. It's not a a kind of a national obsession. But the Milgram experiment, in a way, is, I think, because when something gets dubbed the most famous X in the world, it's kind of achieved a sort of Olympic status in some sense. Now, as far as problems, there's a whole bunch. What issues are still problematic? I'll just list them and say a couple of words, and then we're finished. The 65% result. That's just become too salient. That's become, for many, the Milgram finding. And Tom has mentioned this, and others. This isn't an original observation on my part. It's over-exaggerated as the Milgram study, and it is not. Now, Baumrind played a big role in that initially because in the title of her ethical critique was Milgram, 1963, A Behavioral Study of Obedience. And that was the 65%. You know, the fact that he chose to publish that result first when he did 24, whatever it is, variations, that was to some degree arbitrary. He didn't have to just publish that baseline, right? He could have published, he had already done all of them. He says in a footnote in that article, a fuller report on a series of variations is available or has been done already, something like that. It's in the article. So it was strategic on his part, in a sense, to publish, to pick that study for openers. And it was quickly followed, of course, by a much more complete study, publication in '65. So it wasn't as if he was hiding it all for the book in '74. We knew it by the '65 article in Human Relations, which was titled a study of obedience and disobedience to authority, a beautifully balanced title, emphasizing both obedience and defiance, right early 1965 publication. So serious students, but a probably small number, knew about the whole research program then. Then, of course, the textbook came out in '74, and everybody knew the whole story. But there's a problem with that textbook. Even though I have an autographed copy at home that I cherish, and I personally, liked Stanley very much, and we had a very good relationship. And but the book wasn't peer reviewed. It wasn't a scientific article. It was a book written by a world famous, angry social scientist who had been viciously attacked, and of course adored and praised and applauded, as we did when I invited him to come to Miami in 1974. Riker and Haslam, in their working toward the experimenter, their new theory that has been described here in a few panels, look what they say, that social identity model. This reinterpretation also encouraged us to see Milgram studies not as demonstrations of conformity or obedience, but as explorations of the power of social identity-based leadership to induce active and committed followership. See, active and committed followership, that's not exoneration. You got what I'm saying? That's raw responsibility. Active and committed followership. You can't hardly get more responsible than that, right? If somebody called you an active and committed follower, it describes your motives, it describes your intentions, it describes your mindset, your ideology, they say your identity. And I think personally, I'm giving it some time to play and see how it plays out. But I will say this: anytime I see a theory of obedience or social pressure that seems to go after the harm doer with more personal responsibility and intent, you have to question whether that's one of the motives of the theorist. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, you want that conclusion. So you develop a theory in part so that will be the conclusion. Because it's a very satisfying conclusion, and a lot of people want it. And they're reviled by the exonerating aspects of situationism. So it's a real hot potato if you're teaching this stuff. People will say they adore the Milgram studies, oh, they're so famous. But I think a lot of people don't like them. They don't like the exonerating aspect of it. So I think in evaluating a theory, it's sometimes hard to, it's hard to assess or appraise a theory if you have any suspicion, and I think you should. There's nothing wrong with it. Every theorist has perhaps a bias or an ideological frame that that guides what their theorizing is. It's top down in many ways. It's not all just driven from empirical findings. But you really have to dissect the theory for the implications for punishment of the harm doer. I think theories, explanations are often contain recommendations for punishment. I know they're different. An explanation is not the same thing as a sentence, but they're real close cousins. Thank you very much.